morning. It's good to see you. Somebody asked me this morning, is being an Eastern Standard Time Zone kind of guy, you're probably not used to Central Standard mornings, but I have two boys, Braden and Bryce, and one's an 8th grader, one's a 5th grader, and so when I'm home in Indiana or was there, we'd 6 o'clock in the morning, we'd wake up and we'd get ready for school and start the day. And so now that I'm not there as much during the week, I get up at 5 o'clock here so that I can have breakfast with them there. And so 4:45 to 5 o'clock, it's no big deal. So, and the sun rises this morning. The sunrise was beautiful. The sunset, I was just telling the guys in the back, the sunsets from the new entryway of the facility is quite a remarkable view, and so you'll want to look at that. So hey, my name is Tony, and I get the awesome privilege of being the executive pastor here at Berean, and really excited about what God is doing here and the opportunity to be able to be a part of what He's doing. And so this morning we're just going to talk a little bit about imitate me. Is what we've been talking about for the last several weeks. And so this morning is how I want to share with you the how and the why I share my faith and why that's so important. What I found out here in our culture, we all like to talk about ourselves. We do. And so whether that's our jobs, our families, our kids, we like to talk about ourselves. We like to talk about those things that are important to us and that matter to us. And so like if you were to come up to me and start talking to me about baseball, I'd love to be able to talk to you about my favorite baseball team, which this is the St. Louis Cardinals, right? And my favorite baseball player is a 14-year-old who is 6'1", throws lefty, bats righty, plays first base and pitches, and that's my son. And we could talk about his accomplishments. We can talk about his goals and his dreams in baseball and what he wants to do. And I could talk about a play that he made 2 weeks ago that I wish ESPN was there for. But we like to talk about the things in our lives that are the most important to us. Unfortunately, for most of us in this room, the gospel isn't one of those top priorities. Now, we'll reference God when it comes to things like the sunrises and the sunsets. But when it comes to the importance of the gospel in our lives and the importance of it and the significance of it, for some reason, the gospel is lower on the priority list in conversations. And quite honestly, the reason for that is this. If you and I aren't consistently on a daily basis preaching the gospel to ourselves, we're not going to share the gospel with many other people. In other words, there's this daily habit, a daily reminder of God's grace in our life, not just for the common graces of the sunsets and the foods and the freedom and the liberties, but a daily reminder of the grace of God that saved us from ourselves and gives us an eternity with Him. And so why is that so important? And it's not that every day that I wake up and I say a sinner's prayer. That's not it at all. It's not it at all. But every day, a reminder that the only good thing in my life is the gospel. The only good thing in my life is Jesus. And if you take that out of the equation, there is nothing good in my life. And so the gospel in my life and that reminder is it makes my relationship with my wife that much better. With the gospel in my life, it makes my relationship with my boys that much better. Because if not, I'll just be honest with you, I would ship my 14-year-old to a military school. which I may or may not have threatened him with, all right? but the gospel makes everything better in my life. And so if the gospel makes everything better in my life, why is it not more of a priority for me to have conversations with people about the gospel? So there's a passage of Scripture that I'd like for us just to briefly look at it to serve as a reminder. And this morning, in your table time, you're going to have some very frank and open, honest conversations this morning around your table about this and how it applies to you. But in Mark chapter 4 is the parable of the sower. The parable of the sower. And Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, and it says this: "And he began to teach beside the sea, and a very large crowd gathered about him, so that he got into a boat, sat in on the sea, and the whole crowd was beside the sea on the land. And he was teaching them many things in parables, and in his teachings he said to them, 'Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow.'" So if you have your Bibles or you highlight in your Bibles, that if you underline that or highlight that, what you need to know is that that is going to be the main point of this parable. And then and then I'll explain why. But so if you highlight, underline, write things down. Listen, behold, a sower went out to sow. That's going to be the main point of this parable. So look what he says. "And as he sowed, some seed fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured it. And then other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil, and immediately it sprang up, since it had no depth of soil. And when the sun rose, it was scorched, and since it had no root, it withered away. And other seed fell among the thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked it and yielded no grain. And other seed fell into good soil and produced grain, growing up and increasing and yielding 30-fold and 60-fold and 100-fold. And he said, 'He who has ears to hear, let him hear.'" A lot of times when you read through that passage, or we'll hear teachers or pastors, preachers go through that passage, a lot of times when we do that, the focus becomes being able to identify the types of soil in your life, right? Because basically what Jesus is saying here is he's comparing the various types of soil to the various types of people in and around our lives. You got the fertile soil, you got the rocky soil, you got the thorny soil, and you got the path, right? And that you try to focus and identify those people in your life so that when you identify those people in your life, that you know where to sow. The problem with that is that's not what Jesus is saying. The point of the parable is that Jesus says the sower goes out to sow his seed. And as he's sowing, some seed fall where? On the different types of soil. So the sower isn't walking, and as he's walking, he's like, well, the seed's not going to grow there, so I'm not going to plant it there. It's going to have difficulty there, so I'm not just going to plant it. So the visual that you get is that wherever he goes to sow, guess what he's doing? He sows. He's not discriminating against that little piece of land right there because it's got a few rocks in it, and he's not discriminating against that piece of land because it's got a few thorns on the side, and he's not going, he's concentrating on where he's walking and going, that he is consistently sowing the seed. Consistently sowing the seed. So when then you and I take this parable and we look at it, and we say, okay, well, who are the people in our lives that are like that path? You know, they're the people that they want nothing to do with. They're the type of people that you've always talked about. Like, you never bring up religion or politics or raising children with people, right? You don't have those conversations because they divide people, they get in arguments, and so you don't. Those are the type of people that because of you, they don't want to talk about it. They don't believe in God. They don't want to hear about God, and so that's who they are. And so you just don't talk about it. And so they're the path. So don't share the gospel with them because they want nothing to do with it, except for this. Have you ever been driving down an interstate or driving down a road, and in the middle of the concrete asphalt jungle, there's a weed? maybe in your sidewalks, right? In the little cracks of your sidewalks, in between two, there's a weed, or my boys, when they were younger, thought dandelions were flowers, and so there's a dandelion growing right. And so it's like, well, how in the world does a flower or grass grow in the middle of a sidewalk? Well, common sense says that you don't plant flowers there. You can't plant grass there. You wouldn't plant tomato plants there. You wouldn't. But somehow, some way, some seed was able to make it through a crack. So this concept of being able to say and identify people in your life that, well, this person has nothing, they don't want anything to do with Jesus, and so we're never going to bring it up. And so what you've done two things. You have determined for their life that they don't need God or want God. And then the second thing is you've limited the power of God. Because here's my philosophy on things, right? If Jesus can raise Lazarus from the dead, he can do any dadgum thing he wants. Right? And so if that person in your life that they don't want to talk about God, they don't want anything to do with church, I'm telling you, you continue to sow the seed. When I moved into our first house in Fishers in 2004, I lived it was a cul-de-sac, and two doors down from me, there was a man there. His name was Ron. Ron was in his early 60s. He was about 6'2". He was a Vietnam vet, and he had more ink on his arms and legs and hands than most people. And he was rough. The first conversation that I had with him, I hate telling people what I do for a living because all of a sudden it modifies their behavior, right? When I tell them what I do, it's all of a sudden, like they're like, I don't cuss, I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't do anything, it's like, whatever, right? Well, Ron, he just didn't care. So he found out what to do, and the very first thing he told me is like, I don't believe in God, I believe in aliens. Cool. But we just had lots of conversations, right? And just kept talking, and so eventually just told him, I said, hey, Ron, this is Ron. I'm going to have to share with you why I do what I do and who I am and who I am, and he's like, all right, So over time we have these conversations, but Ron started calling me a rabbi. So from his backyard to my backyard, hey, Rabbi, I got a question for you. And so all right, I walked down, but got to the point of had built up this relationship with Ron, where when he got new appliances in his house, rather than giving the old appliances to Lowe's, who were going to be there to deliver the new ones, he asked me to come down and said, hey, is there anybody in your parish? Because now I was Catholic. Is there anyone in your parish that could use appliances? Ron had never been to church a day in his life. Didn't even get married in a church. And so later on in 2009, when we planted a church from our sending church that I was serving on staff at, Ron was my number one prayer target that I wanted to continue to share the gospel with him. And our opening Sunday, Ron and Rita showed up for church. But you don't sow on concrete. Ron moved to Florida. Never embraced Christ. I will pray for Ron more moving to Minnesota than I did in Indiana, and here's the reason why. When Ron moved to Florida, he gave me his 8.5 horsepower snowblower. It is a beast, and you smell like exhaust when you're done with it. I used it twice in the last 4 years. I imagine I'll use it twice in the first 3 days of next winter. But every time I use that snowblower, I'm reminded not just about Ron, but a lot about people like Ron, who are hard and crusty, who want absolutely nothing to do with Jesus. But yet, if Jesus can raise Lazarus from the dead, surely the seed of the gospel can penetrate even the hardest of hearts. So when I was in college, I had a friend, his name was Chris Morgan, and he would take me on campus and share the gospel with people that we had set up appointments with. And we were walking across campus one day, and we saw these two college kids. I was a college kid, but we saw these two college kids that were working, doing some landscaping stuff. And Chris said, "Hey, you want to let's go talk to these two guys?" And I said, "Well, I know the one. He goes to church with me at Linwood." And he said, "So," I said, "So we don't need to go over there." And he said, "Well, why?" I said, "Well, because he's at Linwood every Sunday." And he stopped me. He said, "You know, Tony, evangelism will never be a priority in your life if you assume that everyone is good. If you assume everyone is good, that you have to really assume that everyone needs what you have. And that when your motivation is that they need Jesus, then your assumption that they need to hear the gospel will override the assumption that you think they're okay because they're a good person or they go to church." So when I think about and think through how I share the gospel and the why I share the gospel is because wherever the sower goes, he sows. Wherever he goes, that's what he does. He sows. And so wherever we go, we have to be committed to being able to make sure that what we leave behind when we walk away is that we leave the good news of the gospel. Everywhere we go. That doesn't mean that when you go to work today and you're sitting there and all of a sudden, you start leaving these, tracts, you're passing out tracts everywhere you go and all this. I'm not talking about that. But in your wake today, of when the places that you leave, the things that you're doing, why not leave the most important thing that could change their life? Why not leave them a morsel? Why not leave that little seed? And sometimes they're asking for it. Sometimes they're asking for advice, or they're asking for prayer. The blizzard weekend here that we had, the last one, of course, how many we had, but the last one, I was on my way here on that Sunday morning, and I couldn't get out of the street because there was a lady who got stuck. And she had tried things on her own. She'd got some cardboard out of her car, and she'd tried everything and couldn't do it. And so I got there, and I've learned since February that I don't go anywhere without hat, gloves, scraper, and a shovel. So I had a shovel in the car and got the shovel out and started helping shovel, and somebody else stopped by, and so we eventually got her out. And so she thanked me, and in part of that conversation, I told her where I was going, and because she said, "Well, you're kind of dressed up, to be out in a snowstorm." I was like, "Well, here's where I'm going. Here's what I'm doing this morning." 3 days later, I got a card in my mailbox up at my office, and it was from this lady. She worked at the grocery store next door. And so she sent me a card to thank me for helping her get out. My wife and family aren't here, so I have lots of late evenings. And so sometimes my dinner may be a Coke Zero and a bag of chips from next door. It's real healthy. And so I was over there, and I saw her, and she saw me. And she came up, and she said, Pastor Tony, how are you doing?" I said, "Well, now that there's not much snow, I'm doing much better." And she went on to tell me that the reason that morning was so important to her is that she lives on a fixed income, and that job helps bridge the gap of what she needs and what she has. And being late or missing a day would cost her financially, but it also could cost her job. And so ultimately what I did is, what she said is that you saved my job. What word did she use there? Ah, you saved my job. Well, I'd really like to have a conversation where there's something more important that gets saved. And so she and I have had a conversation in that little coffee, beer, wine area, which is very odd to me. But during a break, had a conversation about the importance and the significance of Jesus and the ultimate Savior of the world. And I know you sit there and you think this, well, of course, Tony, you're a pastor. That's what you get paid to do. False. I get paid by Berean to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. That's what I get paid to do. I am commanded to share the gospel by Jesus. I'm not called by Berean to share the gospel. I'm not paid by Berean to share the gospel. I am called and commanded by God to share the good news of the gospel wherever I go. And what the parable of the sower says, wherever I go and whatever I do, I'm to share the gospel with anyone and everyone, despite their circumstances, their situations. That's what I'm called to do. That's what I'm commanded to do. It's not a suggestion. It's not if you feel like it today. It is what I'm called and commanded to do. And I'll be honest with you. I have probably flubbed it up way more than I've gotten it right. Probably. I still get nervous at times and sweaty palms and like, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? And how are they going to respond to this? And are they going to like me? And so eventually I've gotten used to the fact that, and taking Jesus at his word, that if they say no to you, they reject you, they hate you. It's not that they hate you and rejecting you, they hate me and they reject him. I've gotten up to that where I was like, oh, okay. But I'm not called and commanded by Berean to share the gospel. I'm called and commanded by Berean to equip the saints for the ministry. But I'm called and commanded by God, by Jesus, to share the good news wherever I go. Wherever I go. And like I said, sometimes I get that right. More times I get it wrong. One Sunday we were leaving church, and I had just preached on Acts 2, which actually is the focal passage of our vision here, Acts 2, 42, 46. Got done preaching, me and my family, when we went to dinner, and one of the challenges that I left with that morning is that wherever we go, whatever we do, God places people in our life for us to be a blessing to them, and that blessing is not necessarily as we go to restaurants, as blessing, obviously tips and encouragement, but ultimately is to be able to leave the gospel. So we go to lunch, and we're there, and our waitress takes her drink order. She comes back, and then asks her how her day is, and then she unloads on us. I mean, not like she's angry, but she just, I asked how her day was, and she told us. And so then we gave her order. She went, and my wife kept looking at me funny, and I couldn't figure out, did I have something on me? Did I, and we got done, and we left, and she goes, wow. Did you listen to the sermon today? I preached the dadgum thing. She goes, did you listen to the sermon today? And I'm thinking, oh man, what happened here? Well, she said, you specifically said at the very end of your sermon today that some of you are going to go out to eat and you're going to do this, that the biggest blessing in someone's life today with a waitress or a waiter may not be the 20% that you're going to leave, but it's the gospel. And you left her a tip, but you didn't leave the gospel. Wah, wah, wah. So it's bad enough when you get it wrong and your wife calls you out, but also when you do it wrong and your kids call you out. We have some very dear friends, Nick and Ileana. Ileana grew up in Puerto Rico. Nick grew up just east of Indianapolis. Neither one of them have a relationship with Jesus. Both of them grew up with a Catholic background and have a very cynical view of the church, but have become really good friends of ours. They have a baby girl that we love, that we would love to steal and have as our own. She's beautiful, gorgeous, and they've become really, really good friends of ours. And we went to dinner one night last fall, and we're sitting there, and I had an extremely long day, extremely long, frustrating ministry day. And so, in fact, it was so long that I just ended up meeting everyone there for dinner. They actually picked up Kelly and the boys and took them there. And so we're having dinner, and so Nick and I are sitting by each other, and Nick starts asking me questions about the difference between Baptists and Catholics. And I gave him the very short, brief, we dunk, you don't. You know, I mean, I was kind of brief. I mean, it was one of those days, right? And so he's asking me questions about what's the difference between Catholic and Baptist, and what is the difference between a Baptist service and a Catholic service, and what's the difference between a pastor and a priest, and the differences in responsibilities. And it's not that he was driving the conversation, and I was not annoyed at him. I was annoyed by my day. So we finished dinner, and so in fact, I remember being so annoyed by my day that he kept asking questions. He worked for Prairie Farms, all right, and I love chocolate milk, right, and so for some odd, strange, unholy, unbiblical reason, I just changed the conversation to chocolate milk. So rather than turning the conversation specifically to Jesus, I changed it to chocolate milk. We had dinner, we finish, we get in the car, we shut the doors, and the very first words out of the mouth of my oldest son was, "Dad, you blew it." And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And Kelly goes, "If there was ever any time that someone was specifically asking to hear the gospel, Nick was asking about the gospel, and you talked about chocolate milk." And my youngest son, Bryce, 11, goes, "Yeah, Dad, I can't back you on this one." I blew it. Gotta sow. And so sometimes I pick up on it, sometimes I don't. But the command that I have in my life is the same command that you have in your life. Is that wherever you're going, whatever you're doing, is to sow the seed. Because you just don't know where it's going to fall and how it could blossom into something that is beautiful and redeeming. Because the reality is this: most of us in this room, if we have a relationship with Jesus, right? You know, my biggest prayer was, as I had two boys, the responsibility of a father as a parent was not to allow them to grow up and have great academics and athletics so they can go to college and do all this. But my biggest prayer, and if you're a parent and as a believer, your biggest prayer is that God would give you the opportunity to continually and constantly share the gospel, that they would embrace Jesus Christ to be a Christ follower. And we pray that, and we share that. I mean, we buy children's books, we buy children's devotionals, we watch VeggieTales. You know, we suffer through those things so they can hear the gospel in their in different forms of media. And I remember when we moved into the house in 2004, about 2 years into it, we were redoing the landscaping outside, and Braden was helping me. And so we took down this old landscaping stuff, and as you took out, it was the metal edging, and it was held in the ground by metal stakes. And I remember as we were taking that out, all of a sudden I hear Braden say, "Hey, Daddy, look at this." And he had 2 of the metal stakes, and he put them together, and he said, "Hey, Dad, you know what this is?" And so I was going to play dumb. I said, "No, what is that?" He goes, "Dad, it's a cross." Like, oh, okay. And then he begins to proceed, right? He goes, "Dad, do you know who died on the cross? You know who died on this cross?" I'm like, "Somebody died on that cross?" He goes, "No, not this cross, Daddy, but do you know who died on the cross?" And I'd been to church my whole life. I'd been to seminary, right? So but I'm like, "No, who died on the cross?" He goes, "Jesus died on the cross." I'm like, "Man, we're getting somewhere." And he goes through, he goes, "Jesus died on the cross." I'm like, "That is awesome." He goes, "But guess what, Dad? He didn't stay on the cross." He's about 3.5 years old. It's right before his little brother was born. 3.5 years old. I was like, he didn't stay on the cross? No. They wrapped him up and they put him in the womb. Womb, tomb, close enough, right? I said, "They did?" He goes, "But guess what, Dad? He didn't stay there either." I said, "He did?" He goes, "No." His dad came down, woke him up, and told him it was going to be all right. 3.5-year-old. And I think through that process, yes, Kelly and I were consistently sharing the gospel with him. But we were also in a community of believers. And he was getting that in a small group missional community setting. He was getting that in a Sunday morning nursery preschool setting. We were overwhelming him with the gospel because he was a priority in our life. And if the people in and around your life aren't a priority, and you just look at them as the path and the rocky soil and the thorny soil or the fertile soil, and they're not really a priority, listen, you won't consistently share the gospel with those people because they don't share as big as a priority as other people. And so one of the things that I've come to learn in this process is that it doesn't begin on how well you know the Roman road. It doesn't begin with how well you know the chapter in the verse that's not, listen. If you aren't consistently and constantly talking to God about those people in your life, you're not talking to those people in your life about God. So for me, sharing the gospel begins with being open with God in prayer and communication, daring him at times to bring people in my life, asking him for the people like the lady who just was stuck in snow, but God opened it up for a gospel conversation. So sometimes the prayer is very specific. God, today, give me an opportunity to share with Bev. But if I'm not talking to God about those people, I promise you I'm not talking to those people about God. So please don't get caught up in trying to identify where these people are in their walk, in life. Number one, it's not fair to them. And number two, it's not your call. Because just like somewhere today on 35, there is a blade of grass that is breaking through the concrete or the asphalt. And this power of the gospel could do the same thing in someone's life if it was sowed. So today around your tables, your exercise is very simple. Is that as we're talking through this, there is someone right now that you can see their face of who needs the gospel. You know their face, you know their name, you know their story. And in fact, you probably know them so well today that you could probably categorize them. Are they a path, rocky, thorny, fertile soil? You probably know them that well. So as you think through that today around your table, I'd like for you to talk about that person. Name them. Pray for them. And encourage and challenge each other this morning around that table to be a sower today. To be a sower. Why? Because we've been commanded to make disciples. We've been commanded to sow the seed. Not a suggestion, not if you have time, not if you feel comfortable, but commanded to sow the seed. Can I pray for you? Father, I thank you for Ray and Sue. Who sowed the gospel in my life in 1979. Of all the things they had going on in their life, that they took the time to teach Vacation Bible School and to share the gospel with me. I thank you for the grace that you extended to me on that day. Father, I pray for every man in this room. Father, I pray for those who know you, who have an intimate relationship with you, and who desire to be all that you've called them to be. And then, Father, sometimes as we struggle to talk about with other people the most important thing that has happened in our life, I pray that you would stir up courage and boldness as we move to obedience. Help us to be a sower. Help us to be a sower. Father, I pray for those of us who are here and maybe we're around these tables and we like hanging out with men and we like that. We like this camaraderie. We like this and maybe that relationship with you isn't as deep as we would like it, or maybe there isn't one at all. And that today would be the day that we'd be able to taste and see that the Lord is good. Father, each of us have these names and faces of people in our lives that need to hear the good news of the gospel. Today, may we be faithful and obedient to do what you've called us to do. And regardless of where they are in life, regardless of their circumstances, may we be a sower that sows the seed and trust you with the results. We love you and we praise you. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name.